There is a specific kind of person you keep finding. You don't look for them. You don't decide to find them. They simply appear in the same bar, the same office, the same dating app, the same circle of friends, and something in you recognizes them. Before you've spoken a single word, the recognition feels like chemistry, like destiny, like finally. And then eventually, it feels like everything you promised yourself you'd never feel again. But here you are, again, not with the same person, but with the same feeling. The same particular quality of hope followed by the same particular quality of devastation. The same cycle of closeness and withdrawal. The same desperate attempt to earn back something you were never sure you actually had. You have asked yourself why. You've read the articles, done the therapy, made the promises, said this time will be different, and meant it every single time. And it has been different on the surface. Different name, different face, different set of specific disappointments. But underneath, something stubbornly, mysteriously, painfully the same. You've started to wonder if there's something fundamentally wrong with you, something you're doing that you can't see, some self-destructive impulse you can't locate, pulling you back to the same emotional terrain, again and again, like a compass that only ever points in one direction. But here is what I want to say before anything else. This is not a character flaw. This is not evidence of damage beyond repair. This is not your fault in the way you think it is. This is your nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do, executing instructions it received before you were old enough to question them, in conditions you had no power to change. And until you understand what it was designed for, specifically, precisely, in the language of what actually happened to you, nothing will actually change. Not because you're not trying hard enough, but because you've been trying to solve a problem you haven't fully seen yet. Let me start at the beginning. Not the beginning of your last relationship, the actual beginning. The first months of your life, before language, before memory as you understand it, before any conscious sense of self, in those first months, and across the first several years, something extraordinary was happening inside your brain. Your nervous system was being built, not just the physical architecture of it, the relational architecture, the system that would determine, for the rest of your life, how you experience closeness, how you tolerate uncertainty in relationships, what you do when you feel threatened by intimacy. How much trust feels possible, how much need feels safe to show. And the primary architect of that system was not you. It was whoever was there. The people who held you when you cried, or didn't. The people who responded to your hunger, your fear, your distress, or didn't. The people who were present when you needed them. Sometimes, always, rarely, unpredictably. The people who repaired the inevitable ruptures of early life, or left them unrepaired, slowly teaching you that some breaks are permanent. John Bowlby, the psychiatrist who spent his career building what we now call attachment theory, called this the primary attachment system, and his central insight was this: a child does not simply need food and shelter to develop into a functioning human being. A child needs a felt sense of safety in relationship to another person, not safety from the world, safety inside a relationship, the felt bodily experience of being close to someone who is consistently there, consistently responsive, consistently able to tolerate your emotional states without withdrawing or collapsing. When a child receives this, not perfectly, not without ruptures, but consistently enough, something extraordinary happens. The nervous system learns that the world is basically safe, that other people are basically trustworthy, that needs can be expressed and met, that connection is available, that it's safe to move away from the caregiver to explore, because the caregiver will still be there when you come back. Bowlby called this secure attachment. And what it produces, in the child who receives it, is something that looks almost like an invisible inheritance, a baseline of safety that follows them into every relationship for the rest of their lives. But what happens when that inheritance doesn't come? Mary Ainsworth was one of Bowlby's most important collaborators, and in the 1970s, she designed an experiment that would become one of the most replicated and cited in the history of developmental psychology. She called it the strange situation. A mother and her infant were brought into an unfamiliar room. The mother sat in a chair. The infant explored. Then a stranger entered. Then the mother left. Then the mother returned. Ainsworth was watching what happened during the separation and, crucially, the reunion. And what she found divided the children. She observed into distinct categories that have held up across 5 decades of subsequent research. The first group, she called them securely attached, protested the separation, showed distress, and upon the mother's return, sought comfort. They were soothed. And then, this is the critical thing, they went back to exploring. They completed a full emotional cycle: distress, comfort, regulation, return to life. The second group, she called them anxiously attached, or ambivalently attached, were inconsolable both during the separation and after the return. When the mother came back, they did something that made no immediate sense. They simultaneously reached for her and pushed her away. They sought comfort from the very person they seemed unable to accept comfort from. They were still dysregulated long after the mother had returned. They could not complete the cycle. The third group, she called them avoidantly attached, seemed almost unbothered. They didn't appear to protest the separation. They didn't appear to seek comfort on reunion. They explored continuously, as if the mother's absence and presence were both irrelevant. But here is the thing Ainsworth didn't know yet, that later researchers discovered. When they measured the physiological stress responses of the avoidant children, their cortisol levels, their heart rates, their galvanic skin response, the numbers were indistinguishable from the anxious children. The avoidant children were experiencing exactly as much distress. They had simply learned not to show it, because showing it, in their specific attachment history, hadn't worked. Let that land for a moment. The child who appears fine is not fine. They have simply learned that distress is not safe to display, that need is not safe to show, that the surest way to maintain proximity to the person they need is to suppress the very signals that would naturally draw that person close. This is one of the most important discoveries in the entire field of attachment research, and it is one of the most underappreciated, because so many of us are that child, grown into adults who tell therapists, tell partners, tell themselves, "I'm fine. I don't really need that much. I'm comfortable alone. I don't get attached easily," who mistake their suppression for independence, who mistake their numbness for strength, who have spent so long managing the appearance of not needing things that they have lost access to knowing what they need, and underneath that managed surface, the same alarm that was sounding in the avoidant infant in Ainsworth's study, the alarm that never stopped, just went quiet, is still running. A later researcher, Mary Main, discovered a fourth category that Ainsworth's original framework hadn't accounted for. She called it disorganized attachment, and it described the children for whom the strange situation produced something different from protest or apparent indifference. It produced a kind of fragmentation, freezing, contradictory, behaviors that seemed to cancel each other out, approaching and withdrawing, simultaneously, or going still, or performing strange repetitive motions. These were the children for whom the primary caregiver was not just inconsistent or emotionally unavailable. These were the children for whom the primary caregiver was frightening. And this created an impossible paradox at the core of their developing psychology, because the attachment system in a child has one imperative: when threatened, seek proximity to the caregiver. But what happens when the caregiver is the threat? The system has nowhere to go. The person who should provide safety is the source of the danger, and the nervous system, confronted with this impossible situation, fragments. It cannot organize a coherent strategy for maintaining connection, and so it produces, in adult life, people who want connection desperately, who feel its absence as a kind of unbearable pain, but who also cannot tolerate it, who approach and withdraw, who love most intensely the people who recreate this original impossible bind, who are drawn, with a pull that defies rational explanation, to relationships that are simultaneously the most meaningful and the most damaging of their lives. Bessel Kolk spent 30 years working with trauma survivors, and what he found, what he eventually titled his landmark book, the one that changed how a generation of clinicians understood psychological suffering, was this: the body keeps the score, not the mind, the body. Your early relational experiences don't live primarily in your conscious memory. They live in your nervous system, in your muscle tension, in your breathing patterns, in your capacity to tolerate uncertainty, in the specific physical sensations that arise when someone gets close, or pulls away, or goes quiet, or expresses needs you don't know how to meet. Kolk's central finding was that trauma, including the relational trauma of insecure attachment, is not primarily a cognitive problem. It is a somatic problem, a problem of the body's regulation system, and this is why insight alone is not enough. You can understand intellectually and completely that the person you're with is replicating the emotional unavailability of a parent. You can see it clearly. You can name it. You can explain it to your therapist with remarkable precision. And then, when they text you after 3 days of silence, you can feel the specific flooding of relief in your chest that momentarily makes everything else irrelevant. Because the knowledge lives in your cortex, and the response lives somewhere older, somewhere that predates language, somewhere that was built before you had any ability to evaluate or choose. James Hollis, a Jungian analyst who has spent his career helping people understand the unconscious patterns that run their lives, calls what we're discussing the haunting of history. What he means is this: your early relational experiences don't simply stay in the past. They project themselves invisibly onto the present. They colonize your perception of new people and new situations, making you see what your history has taught you to expect rather than what is actually there. You do not, when you first meet someone, experience them as they are. You experience them through the template of what you have known. And if the template says, love is something you earn through performance, and is always slightly uncertain, and can be withdrawn without warning, and requires you to manage yourself carefully to keep the other person close, then the person who is simply, straightforwardly, consistently available will register in your nervous system, not as welcome but as suspicious, as boring, as somehow lacking in depth. And the person who is charismatic and warm and then suddenly cold, who makes you feel seen in a way that feels almost miraculous and then becomes unavailable in a way that doesn't quite make sense, who keeps you in a state of slightly elevated uncertainty, was not quite sure where you stand, working to maintain the connection, alert to every subtle shift in their emotional temperature. That person will feel like home, not because home was safe, but because home was familiar. And the nervous system, at its most fundamental level, does not distinguish between familiar and safe. It has been trained to seek the former and to interpret it as the latter. There is a concept in psychoanalytic theory called repetition compulsion. Freud identified it first, though he didn't fully understand it. He noticed that his patients didn't simply remember their early traumatic experiences. They reenacted them. They found ways to recreate in their adult lives the emotional conditions of their original wounds. He found this disturbing. He couldn't account for it. Within his existing framework of the pleasure principle, the idea that humans are fundamentally driven to seek pleasure and avoid pain. Why would anyone be driven again and again toward the very experiences that cause them the most suffering? His eventual explanation, the death drive, thanatos, was one of the least convincing ideas in the entire psychoanalytic tradition. The better explanation came later from attachment research and neuroscience. The repetition compulsion is not a drive toward self-destruction. It is an attempt at completion. The child who couldn't earn consistent love from the parent who withheld it grows into the adult who is specifically drawn to people who withhold, not because they enjoy withholding, but because this is the game they know how to play. The game they have, in some deep and inarticulate way, been practicing their whole lives. The game that contains the original wound and, somewhere in its logic, the original hope. This time, it will go differently. This time I will be enough. This time, I will finally earn the love that was always conditional. But it doesn't work. It cannot work. Because the person in front of you, however much they may resemble the original figure, is not that person. And the love you're seeking to earn is not the love of an adult from another adult. It is the love of a child from a parent who wasn't capable of giving it. And that particular debt cannot be collected from anyone other than the person who originally incurred it, which means it cannot be collected at all, which means the repetition will continue until the underlying wound is addressed, not in the relationship where it keeps showing up, but at the level where it actually lives. Let me describe something you might recognize. You meet someone. The connection feels immediate and intense. There's an electricity that doesn't feel like the mild warmth you've felt with people who were simply kind and present. This feels like recognition, like finding something you didn't know you were looking for. In the beginning, they are present, attentive. They make you feel seen in a way that feels almost unbearably good. And then something shifts, not dramatically, subtly. They're a little less responsive, a little less available. There's a text you sent that was answered hours later, with a brevity that you found yourself reading over and over, trying to determine the meaning. And something in you goes on alert. Not the comfortable alertness of ordinary concern, a specific kind of anxious hypervigilance, scanning for information, replaying recent interactions for anything you might have done wrong, monitoring their emotional temperature with an attention so fine-tuned it exhausts you. You become, without deciding to, a very sophisticated instrument for tracking this person's subtle emotional shifts. You notice things about them that they don't notice about themselves. You anticipate their moods. You adjust yourself, your tone, your needs, your level of demand, to maintain the equilibrium, to keep the connection from threatening to withdraw. This is an extraordinary skill, and it was developed in conditions where it was necessary for survival. The child who grows up with an emotionally inconsistent caregiver learns to read that caregiver's states with exquisite precision. Because proximity to the caregiver depends on getting it right. The child who learns that their parent is available in some moods and dangerous or absent in others becomes an expert in emotional weather reading, not as a choice, but as an adaptive necessity. You bring that expertise into every relationship, and it makes you in some ways extraordinarily perceptive and empathic. And in other ways, it makes genuine rest in relationship almost impossible, because you are always at some level working, always scanning, always adjusting, always trying to earn something that, in a truly secure relationship, doesn't need to be earned at all. Carl Jung wrote something that I find myself returning to when I think about this. He said, "We cannot change anything unless we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses." I want to apply this specifically to the pattern we're discussing. Most people, when they begin to understand their attachment wounds, move quickly to a particular stance. I need to fix this. I need to stop doing this. I need to be different. And this stance, however well-intentioned, is itself often an expression of the wound. The anxiously attached person who decides they need to stop being anxious and needy and demanding, and then hates themselves every time the anxiety resurfaces, is replicating the original dynamic in which their emotional states were unwelcome, in which they needed to suppress themselves to maintain connection, in which there was something wrong with them that needed to be managed or corrected. The wound doesn't heal through self-condemnation. It heals through something much harder, through looking at it clearly, through understanding it, not as a flaw to be corrected, but as a logical, coherent, intelligent response to specific conditions that no longer exist. Through accepting that this part of you, the part that is still trying to earn love from someone who withheld it, the part that mistakes familiarity for safety, the part that finds consistent love slightly suspicious, this part is not your enemy. It is your history, doing the best it knew how to do. Viktor Frankl discovered something in the concentration camps that seems, initially, far removed from what we're discussing. He observed that the capacity for psychological survival in conditions of extreme suffering was not correlated with physical strength. It was not correlated with intelligence. It was not correlated with previous mental health. It was correlated with something he called the freedom of the inner life. The capacity to maintain, even in conditions of complete external powerlessness, a relationship to meaning, a sense that one's suffering was connected to something larger than itself, that there was something even here that could be chosen. He wrote, "Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." The space between stimulus and response. When the person you love goes quiet, that is the stimulus. The flooding anxiety, the compulsive phone checking, the internal catastrophizing, the urgent need to do something to close the distance, that is the response. And for most people, in the grip of an activated attachment wound, there is no space between them. The response arrives before conscious thought. It arrives as sensation, as tightening in the chest, as urgency in the throat, as a kind of cognitive narrowing that makes the silence feel like evidence of something terrible. Healing attachment wounds is not about eliminating the response. The response is wired in. It cannot be simply decided away. It is about creating the space, the capacity, cultivated slowly, through practice and new experience, to notice, something in me has just interpreted that silence as abandonment. To pause in that noticing, to ask, is that interpretation accurate? Is this situation actually what my nervous system is telling me it is? Or am I looking at the present through the lens of the past? This sounds simple. It is extraordinarily difficult, because the nervous system in the grip of attachment activation is not in a state that invites reflection. It is in a state that demands action. It is a threat detection system on high alert. And asking it to pause and reflect is asking it to do something it was specifically designed not to do. But with practice, with the right support, with enough new experiences that contradict the old predictions, the pause becomes more available. The space grows, and in that space, choice becomes possible. There is a researcher whose work I want to spend some time with, because I think it reframes the entire question of healing in a way that most people haven't encountered. His name is Daniel Siegel. He's a clinical professor of psychiatry at UCLA, and he has spent his career at the intersection of neuroscience, attachment theory, and human development. And one of his most important findings concerns what he calls the narrative of the self. In his research on attachment across generations, Siegel found something remarkable. The strongest predictor of a child's attachment security was not the parent's own childhood. It was not whether the parent had experienced trauma, loss, neglect, or inconsistent care. The strongest predictor was whether the parent had made sense of their own childhood experience, not whether it was good, whether they had understood it. Parents who had experienced difficult, even traumatic childhoods, but who had developed a coherent, emotionally integrated narrative about those experiences, who could speak about their history with specificity, with feeling, and with some understanding of how it had shaped them, were significantly more likely to have securely attached children. Parents who had experienced similarly difficult childhoods, but who remained confused about their history, or who minimized it, or who had developed rigid, defended narratives that couldn't integrate the emotional complexity of what had happened. These parents were significantly more likely to transmit insecure attachment to their children. The pattern was not deterministic. The wound was not automatically inherited, but the understanding, or its absence, was. What Siegel's research suggests is that the most powerful form of healing is not the elimination of the wound. It is the coherent narration of it, the capacity to say, this is what happened to me. This is what it meant at the time. This is how it shaped what I came to expect from relationships. This is how that shaping is still visible in my life. And this is how I am gradually learning to update those expectations in light of what is actually possible now. That narrative, held with clarity and with feeling, and is not just healing for you, it is literally protection for whoever comes after you. Let me now turn to something that tends to make people uncomfortable, the question of what you're attracted to. Not in the abstract, specifically, the specific texture of attraction that activates you most powerfully. Because attachment research has found something that most dating advice completely ignores. The quality of attraction you feel in a new relationship is not a reliable indicator of relationship quality. It is an indicator of attachment activation. This distinction is crucial. When you feel an immediate, intense, almost overwhelming pull towards someone, when they make you feel seen and electric and slightly off balance in a way that no one nice or available ever has, what you are feeling is not necessarily love. What you may be feeling is the activation of your attachment system by cues that match your relational template. The person who matches the template, who has the emotional fingerprint of your original attachment figure, who gives and withholds in a rhythm your body recognizes, who produces in you the specific combination of longing and uncertainty. That was the texture of your earliest experience of closeness. That person will feel magnetic, not because they are right for you, because they are familiar. And the person who doesn't match the template, who is simply there, simply consistent, simply available, who doesn't produce the same anxious electricity, can feel flat, boring, lacking in depth or passion. This is not because they are actually flat or boring or lacking in depth. It is because your nervous system has been calibrated to interpret the absence of anxiety as the absence of love, to interpret calm as the absence of feeling, to interpret availability as something slightly suspect. And this calibration, unless it is seen and actively worked with, will reliably steer you toward the very relational patterns that replicate your wound, and away from the very relational patterns that might actually heal it. Gabor Mate, the physician and trauma researcher whose work has reached millions of people, speaks about what he calls the myth of normal. His central argument is that what we call psychological dysfunction, addiction, anxiety, depression, chronic illness, is not, in most cases, a random malfunction. It is a reasonable response to unreasonable conditions. The child who grows up in an environment where emotional needs are not met does not simply suffer. They adapt. They develop strategies for getting what they can from an environment that isn't giving them what they need. And those strategies, which were intelligent and even life-saving in the original context, persist into adult life, where they become the very patterns that cause suffering. The anxious adult who monitors their partner's emotional temperature with exhausting precision was, as a child, doing something that made sense. They were reading the emotional weather of a caregiver, whose availability was unpredictable, so they could calibrate themselves to maximize the chances of connection. The avoidant adult who insists they don't really need much from relationships, who becomes uncomfortable with expressions of need in themselves or others, was, as a child, doing something that made sense. They learned that showing need produced distance rather than proximity, and adapted by suppressing the signal. The disorganized adult who is simultaneously desperate for love and terrified of it, who can feel the pull of connection and the urge to destroy it in almost the same breath, was, as a child, doing the only thing possible in an impossible situation. None of this is pathology in the sense of malfunction. It is adaptation in the sense of extraordinary unconscious intelligence. But adaptation to one environment can become a liability in a different environment. And the relational environment of adult life, with its possibilities for genuine mutuality, genuine safety, genuine love without condition, is a very different environment from the one these adaptations were built for. Let me be specific about what healing actually looks like, not in the abstract, in practice, because most discussions of attachment wounds end in a place of vague, therapeutic optimism that doesn't quite tell you what to do on a Tuesday. When the person you love has gone quiet and your nervous system is doing what your nervous system does. The first thing is the simplest and the hardest. You have to know what you're working with, not just intellectually. Specifically, what is your attachment style, not as a label, but as a lived experience? What does activation feel like in your body? Where does it live? What thoughts accompany it? What behaviors does it pull you toward? This specificity matters because the nervous system doesn't respond to general insight. It responds to the experience of being caught in a pattern and being able to recognize it in real time. I'm feeling the familiar tightening in my chest that I feel when I perceive distance. This is my nervous system interpreting uncertainty as abandonment. This may or may not be an accurate reading of the situation. That, said to yourself in the moment, with honesty and without self-judgment, is more useful than hours of retrospective analysis. The second thing is equally difficult. You have to tolerate the feeling without acting on it. This is where most people struggle, because the attachment activation demands action. It demands that you close the distance, that you send the message, that you do something to resolve the uncertainty. And sometimes that action is appropriate. Sometimes the distance is real and worth addressing, but often, especially in the early stages of working with your attachment patterns, the action is the wound trying to recreate its familiar territory. The text sent in anxiety is not a request for connection. It is a test for rejection. The confrontation initiated from a place of flooding is not a bid for understanding. It is the wound checking to see if the prediction is true. Learning to feel the activation fully, without immediately acting on it, is the most specific and the most demanding thing that attachment healing requires, and it is not something you do alone. The third thing is the most important and the most misunderstood. Healing attachment wounds requires new relational experience, not just insight, not just understanding, not just the right books and the right podcast and the right therapist who helps you make sense of your history. New relational experience in which the feared catastrophe, the abandonment, the withdrawal, the confirmation that you are too much or not enough doesn't happen. This experience can come from therapy. A therapist who is consistently present, who repairs ruptures when they occur, who doesn't withdraw in the face of your need or your anger, is providing a form of new relational experience that gradually revises the nervous system's predictions. It can come from friendship, the slow accumulation of being known and still wanted, of conflict that doesn't end connection, of vulnerability that is met with care, and it can come from romantic relationship, but only if you can hold enough awareness of the pattern to recognize when you are choosing familiarity over genuine suitability, and to stay present to the experience of being with someone whose consistency is real rather than performed. This is not a quick process. It is not linear. There will be steps backward. There will be moments when the old pattern returns with a vividness that makes the new understanding feel very thin. But the nervous system is plastic, far more plastic, across the full lifespan than we once believed. New experience lays down new predictions. New predictions change behavior. Changed behavior produces new experience. And gradually, over time, with support, with practice, the cycle begins to run in a different direction. I want to talk about something that most discussions of this topic don't address directly: what you do in the relationship with yourself. Because the attachment wound doesn't only live in your relationships with others, it lives just as powerfully in how you relate to your own internal experience. The anxiously attached adult who monitors their partner's emotional temperature with hypervigilance also typically monitors their own internal states with a particular kind of harshness. The very needs and feelings that their caregivers couldn't meet. The longing, the fear, the anger, the grief, and often feel to them like evidence of their unworthiness. Too much, too needy, too sensitive, too emotional. They have internalized, somewhere deep, the judgment that was originally delivered from outside. And so the healing is not only about finding relationships that go differently, it is about developing what the psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott called the capacity to be alone, not in the sense of isolation, but in the sense of being able to be present to one's own experience, without immediately needing to do something about it. To feel the longing and not immediately reach for someone to fill it. To feel the anxiety and not immediately act to resolve it. To feel the grief and not immediately suppress it. To sit with the fullness of one's own interior, life with a quality of presence that the original caregivers may not have been able to provide. This is, in essence, the capacity to parent yourself, to offer your own inner experience the consistent, attuned, non-withdrawing presence that you needed and didn't fully receive. It is not a substitute for real relationship, but it is foundational to the capacity for it, because you cannot receive consistent love from another person until you have developed enough of that consistency in your relationship with yourself to recognize it when it arrives. There is a researcher whose name is Sue Johnson. She developed a form of couples therapy called Emotionally Focused Therapy, EFT, and it is, at this point, the most empirically validated couples intervention in the world. Study after study has demonstrated its effectiveness, and its underlying model is entirely attachment-based. Her central insight is this: most relationship conflict, the cycles of accusation and withdrawal, the fights that keep happening about different surface subjects but feel fundamentally identical, the inexplicable intensity that seems disproportionate to whatever the official topic is not actually about the official topic. It is an attachment protest. One person, feeling the distance that threatens their sense of connection, moves toward the other, sometimes with gentleness, but often with anxiety-driven aggression or tears or demands, or the specific behavior that the other person finds most difficult to tolerate. The other person, feeling overwhelmed or threatened by the intensity, withdraws, shuts down, goes quiet, becomes the stone wall that the first person is now escalating against. And the first person, whose worst fear is being left, experiences the withdrawal as confirmation of that fear and escalates further, trying to get through, while the second person, whose worst fear is being overwhelmed, engulfed, losing themselves in relationship, experiences the escalation as confirmation of their fear and withdraws further. Johnson calls this the demand-withdraw cycle. And what makes it so destructive is not the surface behavior, but the underlying attachment panic that drives it. Under the accusation is, I need you and I'm terrified you're not there. Under the withdrawal is, I feel overwhelmed and I'm terrified of losing myself. Two people, each terrified, each doing the thing most likely to activate the other's terror, and neither of them in the grip of the cycle, able to say the vulnerable thing that might actually break it. Because the vulnerable thing, the actual truth, which is I need you and I'm afraid, requires exactly the kind of openness and risk that the wound was built to protect against. Martin Buber, the philosopher whose work on genuine encounter is among the most beautiful in the Western tradition, wrote about what he called I-thou relationship. He distinguished between two fundamental modes of relating. The first, I-it, is the mode in which we relate to others as objects, as means to our ends, as instruments for our needs. The mode in which we see them through the filter of our projections, our fears, our relational history, rather than as they actually are. The second, I, though, is the mode of genuine encounter, in which two people meet fully in their actual present reality, in which neither reduces the other to a function in their psychological drama, in which each is genuinely seen and genuinely seeing. Buber believed that I-thou moments are rare, that most of our relating operates in I-it mode most of the time. And I think this is especially true in the grip of attachment wounds. When your attachment system is activated, when the old fear is running, when the prediction machine is grinding away, you are not seeing the person in front of you. You are seeing the composite figure that your history has constructed. You are seeing the parent who withdrew, the partner who left, the person who couldn't love you the way you needed. And the tragedy is that this composite, this projection, prevents genuine contact with the actual person who is actually there. Healing attachment wounds is, among other things, the long and demanding practice of learning to see people as they are rather than as your history has taught you to expect them to be. It requires, as Buber would say, the willingness to be genuinely surprised, to let the person in front of you be different from what you predicted, to remain open to the possibility that the expected withdrawal might not come, that the familiar devastation might not arrive, to risk again what has previously hurt you, not blindly, not without discernment, but with enough openness to allow the experience of being wrong in the best possible way. Rainer Maria Rilke, the poet whose letters on love and solitude remain some of the most psychologically astute things ever written, said this: "For one human being to love another, that is perhaps the most difficult of all our tasks. The ultimate, the last test and proof, the work for which all other work is but preparation. I have always found this both comforting and destabilizing. Comforting because it acknowledges the genuine difficulty. It doesn't pretend that love is easy, or that connection is simple, or that the fact of your struggle means something is wrong with you specifically. Destabilizing because it suggests that this, the relational difficulty, the patterns, the wounds, the repeating cycles, is not a detour from the work of life. It is the work, the most important work, the work for which all other work is preparation." And maybe that reframe, which is not optimistic in a shallow sense but honest in a deep one, is the most useful thing I can offer. You keep finding the same person in different faces because something in you is still trying to complete something, still trying to finish the emotional work of your first relationships, still trying to get it right. That trying, however misdirected, is not evidence of brokenness. It is evidence of a longing so deep and so persistent that it has organized decades of your relational life around its fulfillment. The question is not how to kill that longing. The longing is not the problem. The question is how to bring it into consciousness, clearly enough that you can begin to meet it. Not through repetition, not through the hope that this time the unavailable person will finally be available, but through the slow, patient, courageous work of learning to tolerate and seek and receive what you have, perhaps for most of your life, believed was not quite available to you. There is a practice in mindfulness-based approaches to attachment, healing that I want to describe, because it is simple and it works. When you feel the familiar activation, the anxiety, the urgency, the pull to do something to close the distance, the practice is not to suppress it, not to reason it away, not to tell yourself you shouldn't be feeling this. The practice is to name it. Specifically, there's the tightening in my chest I know well. There's the familiar story that something has gone wrong. There's the urge to check my phone again, to send another message, to do something to resolve the uncertainty. And then, just for a moment, I'm to be curious about it rather than controlled by it. What does this feel like? Where is it in my body? How old does it feel? And then, this is the hardest part to ask. Is this present moment information or historical information? Is this situation actually what my nervous system is telling me it is? Or am I looking at Tuesday afternoon through the lens of a childhood wound? This practice does not eliminate the activation, but it creates the space Frankl was describing, the space between stimulus and response. And in that space, when that small, hard-won, occasionally available space, something other than the automatic response becomes possible. Not always, not immediately, not without enormous practice, but gradually, in the specific, unglamorous daily way that all genuine change actually happens. I want to end not with a conclusion one because the work we're describing doesn't conclude, but with something more honest. The pattern you're in is real. The wound is real. The way it has organized your life, your choices, your attractions, your defenses, all of it is real. And changing it will be harder than understanding it. There will be moments when the old pattern returns with full force. When you find yourself, again, choosing the familiar over the possible. When the available person feels flat and the unavailable person feels electric, and your understanding of why this doesn't help even slightly. This is not failure. This is what it looks like to work with something that is wired into the nervous system. You are not trying to become a different person. You are trying to build something new alongside what is already there. New experience, new predictions, new evidence for the nervous system that the old catastrophe is not inevitable. It is slow work. It is humbling work. It is work that will require you to be kinder to yourself than your early caregivers were, not as a therapeutic exercise, but as a genuine reparenting of the part of you that still believes it needs to earn its right to be here. And it is the most important work there is. Because the pattern you heal in yourself is the pattern that stops here. That doesn't get passed on. That doesn't shape the relational world of whoever comes after you. And that, the stopping of something that has been running for generations, is not a small thing. It is perhaps the most quietly radical thing a person can do. Think about it.